Okay, we're going to make a start. So we've got a session, a panel of speakers and some time for questions like similar panels have gone through this morning. And then there'll be a break after this session. So the session is on net zero and energy, and we've got 3 speakers. And just as a little preamble, just before we get started and before I introduce the speakers. So my name's Alice Larkin. I'm a professor of climate science and energy policy. Been at the university for quite a long time and you know, very interested to hear the 3 talks that we've got in this session and also your own questions on this subject. Just a few weeks have passed since the last international climate negotiations were happening in Azerbaijan. And it was, you know, some of you may have been paying attention to what was going on and hearing bits and bobs in the media, but I think it would be fair to say that it was much lower profile than the similar event that happened in Paris in 2015. There was certainly a lot of optimism after the Paris climate agreement was set in 2015. And I think that certainly there's not a kind of replication of that sense of optimism after this latest meeting. Researchers are now faced with a stark reality that emissions are still rising. So despite the fact that countries have been coming together and discussing climate change and working to reduce emissions, unfortunately, it's still on a rising trajectory. And it's also increasingly evident that the climate impacts are catastrophic, particularly for people in the global south. Richer nations have not been delivering on their commitments and on the scale of the emission reductions that are required, and poorer countries are requesting greater levels of support in order to not only mitigate their own emissions, but also to deal with the damaging impacts of climate change. So that's the context, that's the setting that we're in 2024, at the end of 2024, arguably within the middle of a critical decade where we really haven't put ourselves on a path to actually turn the ship around, if you like. So to touch on some of these challenges, here there's going to be a focus on some of the opportunities that could be realized with the right business models or the right political will within perhaps richer nations, but also explore if and how other non-climate related crises have influenced progress in terms of climate action. So taking account of the other things that are going on in the world that intersect with the climate change debate and agenda. So first up, we're going to have Jingyi Li. Dr. Li is a research associate in the Tyndall Center in the School of Engineering. And she's going to talk about addressing energy equity with mine water heating in former coal regions, exploring their potential for decarbonising the heat in the UK. After that, we're going to have Dr. Tim Braunholtz-Speight, a researcher who's also in the Tyndall Center and in the School of Engineering. And he's going to focus on the low carbon housing affordability in the context of housing developer business models and financing arrangements in collaboration with Greater Manchester Combined Authorities. And then we're going to have Matt Paterson, who is director of the Sustainable Consumption Institute and professor of international politics in the School of Social Sciences, who's going to talk about contemporary crises and net zero transitions and exploring if and how crises such as the Russian invasion of Ukraine and COVID-19 have influenced progress on climate action. So that's a summary of what we've got to come. And first up, we're going to have Jingyi. Thank you.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. I am Jingyi Li, a postdoctoral researcher based at Tyndall Center for Climate Change Research. This project is collaborating with Dr. Alejandro Gallego-Schmidt, who is also the PI of the project, and also Professor Kathy Hollitz from Department of Environmental and Earth Sciences. Today, my presentation is titled Reclaiming the Past, Harnessing Mine Water for Sustainable Heating, with a primary focus in Northeast England. I understand that this topic is quite ambitious, especially when paired with a niche technology. So I'd like to begin with some clarifications. What is mine water heating and why Northeast England? The reason I focus on mine water heating lies in addressing broader global climate change challenge. To limit the global warming by 1.5 to 1.5 degrees C as per the Paris Agreement, we have a remaining global carbon budget of 170 gigatons of carbon dioxide. At the current annual emission rate of 41.6 gigatons, this budget would be exhausted in just 4 years. This unprecedented urgency makes the large-scale decarbonization no longer a choice, but a mandate. Additionally, achieving this transition must be just and equitable, aligning with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals for 2030. This means that every low-carbon energy resource has a role to play. And one such resource is mine water, which is generally the naturally occurring geothermal energy, which is quite largely untapped in the UK. Well, after the coal mines are closed and become flooded, this is what we refer to as mine water. So usually in the UK context, this water stabilizes at a temperature around 12 to 20 degrees C. People usually will drill 2 boreholes at the mine water site. Luckily, just after a few hundred meters of drilling, you can reach the target. And this water will be pumped to the surface, and its thermal energy will be extracted through a heat exchanger to the district heating network. A heat pump will be situated in the energy center, which would be also adjacent to the mine water site, further bringing the temperature up to 65 to 70 degrees C, making it suitable for heating homes and businesses. One notable example is the Gateshead District Energy Scheme, which began in operation in 2023. It currently supplies heat to social housing and nearby heat users. This scheme also incorporates a small solar farm to provide the renewable electricity to power the heat pump when the weather conditions allow, as shown on the top of this slide. Despite the UK recognized the potential for mine water heating as early as 2010, very few projects are in operation nationwide. In contrast, the Netherlands identified the potential for mine water heating, and after 5 years development, launched its first mine water district heating scheme in 2008. By 2013, this was upgraded to a 30 megawatts, a fifth generation heating and cooling grid with 30 megawatts of heating and 60 megawatts for cooling, enabling the simultaneous exchange for heat and cold between all the customers. According to the 2020's data, this low-carbon heating network could save 1,250 tons of carbon dioxide annually. And the reason of the focus in Northeast is due to its abundant coal mines. Historically, Northeast was a major contributor to the coal industry, at its peak accounting for up to 19% of the UK's coal production, exceeding 200 million tons per year. In 1913, the Northeast coal output could provide heating for over 30 million homes annually. Even in 1994, which is after the miners' strike, I believe all of you would be aware of this. And the Northeast coal output can still provide heat for 720,000 homes annually. In terms of the employment, Northeast provided direct jobs to 250,000 people during its peak time. This is equivalent to recruit the entire population of a medium-sized city, such as Orlando in Florida of the United States. It has been seen as the heart of the Britain. But nowadays, Northeast faces significant socioeconomic challenges due to the lingering effects of the deindustrialization and the closure of the coal mines, along with the pressure of the climate change. It has the lowest GDP per head of all UK regions, lagging behind London by over £36,000. Beyond that, Northeast has the second highest Gini coefficient and the lowest aggregated total wealth, revealing the high-level wealth inequality. Moreover, this region also has 25% of the population living below the poverty line, with the lowest working age employment rate but the highest economic inactivity rate. not only the deeply rooted socioeconomic disparities, Northeast always suffer from a higher proportional fuel poverty rate compared to the England average conditions without London. Many households struggle to afford basic heating due to the low income but high energy costs. These statistics highlight the urgent need of targeted policy intervention to promote the equitable and sustainable regional and energy development. So can mine water be one of the solutions? If so, how can we effectively deploy it? In this research, we have two aims. So firstly, I'm trying to understand what are the drivers and the barriers to effectively deploy the mine water heating network. Secondly, we would like to propose corresponding policy recommendations. So I have conducted 33 semi-structured interviews across 9 stakeholder groups as listed on this slide. And in the following presentation, I'm going to call the local residents and former coal miners as the general public groups. Here are some main findings. So deploying the mine water heating network, according to my interview analysis, aims to provide one of the possible solutions to the challenges balancing the energy security, environmental sustainability, and also the energy equity. We call it energy affordability as well. It can serve as an enabler in these 3 areas. Undoubtedly, due to its lower energy requirement to bring up the temperature and the nature of utilizing a renewable resource, which is geothermal energy, this network can play a strategic role in decarbonizing the heating sector. Since the heating network can accommodate various heating sources, it also offers the opportunity for further expansions of this low-carbon heating network. Moreover, the most attractive selling point is the use of the local heating source, which can significantly reduce the need of the large-scale heating supply infrastructure construction elsewhere, thereby lowering the associated cost. And from the heat users or general public's perspective, mine water heating network offers a long-term safety and also lower operating cost due to a heat interface unit will be installed instead of gas boiler to home, and this will be totally managed by the local authorities. However, there are also 3 distinct barriers that are hindering the effective deployment. So the main barriers stem from the gap between the expectations and actual delivery capabilities. The expectations for effective implementation in order to reduce the carbon emissions in heating sector faces uncertainties in terms of time and scale. The actual speed for the project delivery remains doubtful in terms of how many private households and commercial heat users can be connected to the network. And currently, the project's small to medium scale is not that attractive to the experienced industrial leaders due to the various of the profitability. And also, this would result in a lack of participants in terms of like drilling, welding, and pipeline engineers, etc. But these are all intricately linked with the availability of the funding schemes, which local authorities usually will be responsible for. In terms of the success rate, how much funding you can get, and future investment opportunities. These kind of certainties make a lot of local authorities struggling. Despite there being available funding schemes such as Green Heat Network funding, the competition was incredibly high. Not all the eligible regions can succeed. Well, from the general public groups, there's a well-established belief that for a substantially cheaper energy price, if they switch to this network. However, there's only a 5% cheaper energy price guaranteed when compared with the market rate of the fossil fuels. But there could be a chance for the fossil fuel heat source experience a 17% increase in a year, evidenced by the data from the 2022 to 2023, making this kind of benefits is not sufficient to convince the people to switch to this network, especially for the private households. So based on the identified barriers to effectively deploying the mine water heating projects, I would like to share 2 key policy recommendations. Before delving into these details, it is important to highlight that although these recommendations are proposed based on the specific findings of the mine water heating, it is also applicable to other low carbon energy projects in their early deployment stages. So these projects, which are still working to establish their market share, could play a strategic role in the ongoing efforts to phase out the fossil fuels. So firstly, the central government should provide sufficient tailored direct funding support to the small to medium-sized renewable heating schemes because they are in their early deployment stages, to prioritize economically disadvantaged communities such as the former coalfield regions while shifting away from supporting the fossil fuels. Secondly, it is necessary to take affirmative actions. One of the possible solutions could be introducing the compulsory corporate social responsibility to fossil fuel industries to allocate their certain percentage of the net profits into the regional low carbon transition, social welfare, skills transfer, and development. This is because the fossil fuel sector and the geothermal sector share overlapping competencies, such as the geological analysis, site assessment, drilling and pipeline engineering, etc., creating a direct alignment of skills and expertise. And here are some main takeaway messages. So firstly, mine water can play a strategic role in addressing the carbon emissions, energy affordability, energy security, while diversifying the energy system in coalfield communities. And secondly, the main challenge is the ineffective implementation with insufficient support for energy projects at their early deployment stage, not the readiness level of the technology. And last but not the least, it is very essential to accelerate the project delivery and introduce the bespoke policy and funding support. I'd like to close my presentation by giving a call back to the motivation for me to conduct this research. So I'm going to quote a line from Professor Kevin Anderson, who is prominent climate scientist based at Tyndall and also Uppsala University in Sweden, that the climate change is not an issue of technology and science. It is fundamentally an issue of equity and ethics. If we fail to address these, we fail to address climate change. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Jingyi. So we have a few minutes, I think, for questions. Does anybody have any questions that they'd like to raise? Raise your hands. Anything? Yes.
Hi, I was just wondering if you could look at combining that work with some of the grants that, excuse me, are available for insulating homes, then you'd double the impact of the saving because you'd only need, well, I'm just saying half the energy, but a lot less energy to heat the same homes.
Yeah, I think that's actually the next step of this project needs to look at how dynamically the heat demand will change with the retrofitting of the houses and also incorporating with this kind of niche technology, but they are low carbon heating projects and to be seen in the UK. And we have group of researchers actually later on team will touch on for the affordable housing, and he will, I believe his project is having some relations with the installation as well. And to be honest, this is actually the idea in my head. I need to look into how it dynamically changing with each other. And sometimes based on that to expand a little bit is not only one energy can solve all the problems. So next step, I probably will also look at the hybrid systems, how it can improve the energy efficiency in terms of the heating, in terms of the heating. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much. I think we've still got time for further questions. There's a couple at the back. Anyone else want to ask? Yeah, right. I think right at the back. Is there a microphone? Do you want to shout?
That's a good question, which I actually realized when I was saying about why there's a lack of participant in terms of drilling, welding, pipeline engineering in this geothermal sector. But we all know that UK has extensive experiences in the offshore oil and gas industry, and drilling for a few hundred meters compared to a few thousand kilometers, in the sea. This is nothing, but I'd say like geothermal sector, or for this local heating project, is not that attractive in terms of the profit. And for all the investors and project developers, they prefer a short-term economic return, which this project requires a really long-term payback. Not everyone can accept it, so lack of the bidders for joining the geothermal sector as well. So one of the policy recommendations today I propose is also to take the affirmative actions. If you compete with very profitable sector, this kind of addressing the energy equity issue and low profit return, long time payback will never win. So unless you can allocate directly, and central government should play a very critical role in allocating this kind of the skills and expertise transfer to line up this kind of the low carbon transition for this quite socioeconomically deprived regions.
Thanks very much. Okay, so I think we're going to move on. So let's have a big round of applause for Jingyi. Thank you. Okay. So next up we have Tim. So Tim Braunholtz-Speight is going to talk about low carbon housing affordability. And have a mic.
Hi, so thanks very much. So truly affordable net zero housing finance. So this is a project about the intersection, I guess, of housing, of decarbonisation and the finance sector. So I'm going to give, it's a work in progress, as many of these are. So I'm going to give a little overview of the project and the team, the kind of big picture context, then narrowing it in on the particular research problem that we're wanting to address, what we're doing, the story so far, and what we're going to do next. So it's an unmade priming project, or seed corn project, you could say. We're kind of in the middle. We've got a little bit longer actually than that, so we're probably a little bit less than halfway at the moment. The research team, there's a group of us from the Tyndall Centre in the School of Engineering, so myself, Claire Brown, also Carly McLaughlin and Maria Sharmina. We have two other people from the University of Manchester who are both in the room, I'm happy to say. So Matt Paterson, who's up in a moment, and Jair, who's up at the back. So doing kind of a politics and a materials, you know, a very interdisciplinary team. And we also have a kind of unpaid, because it's external, but a kind of honorary member of the team, Tom Archer from Sheffield Hallam, who's a colleague some of whose work kind of inspired the original idea for this project. And yeah, so a bit of the context for it. There's lots of challenges around housing in the UK at the moment. One of them is the decarbonisation challenge. We can see on the left here, this pink bit, 15% of the UK's carbon emissions from residential buildings. And on the right, you can see that these are existing buildings, existing homes, and even current new build homes are not particularly energy efficient. They need to get to here a lot more. And then another challenge, and maybe the one more on most people's minds, is affordability. So there's quite a graph from the Financial Times here. House prices going up and up, apparently more affordable relative to people's wages, and more unaffordable than they ever have been since 1876. So already you see you need to kind of improve houses, but they're already very, very expensive. And this kind of feeds into, although this is, the price of houses is obviously it's a challenge for kind of the social sustainability. It's a challenge for anyone wanting to buy a house or to rent. The flip side of it is that the price of houses and wealth tied up in houses becomes a major part of the UK's kind of financial sector. So, moving on. And there's almost what I've kind of called, in a slightly dramatic term, a cannibalization logic to the way we save in our piggy banks for the future. So for lots of people, the state pension's fairly low. A lot of people who can, or everyone is encouraged to save through a workplace or private pension. And that's supposed to provide your security to the future. And we know in universities that there's a lot of controversy about workplace pensions, and people are very keen to have them. So therefore, people rely on the financial returns from whatever that pension is invested in to provide for their future. And often that pension is invested in infrastructure. For example, the universities, one is the biggest shareholder in Thames Water, other infrastructure companies, and in housing development. But what if the need for these returns makes sustainability measures economically unviable in the short term, therefore making the future environmentally unviable and also disastrous? So you have, these are a picture of the recent flooding in Spain. It's obviously an environmental and human disaster, but also an economic disaster leading to our poor pensioner discovering they haven't got any pension left in the future either. So there's a kind of potentially there might be a self-defeating logic in this relying on that kind of investment in housing to provide for the future. But is there? I mean, I suppose that's kind of the big picture of which this project is looking at. It's a genuine question. There are many factors affecting the transition to a kind of lower carbon society and decarbonizing housing. Finance is just one, and is it a constraint or an enabler? In what way? And I guess it's also an enormous question. It's a kind of a big global question. Most developed countries are grappling with it. So we're not trying to answer it all in this UMRI project, but we're zeroing in on a particular part of the question. If you do want to read more about the bigger picture, there's a couple of readings there. But the particular question, so how to build net zero homes for all, how to afford to find the money to do it. Because we know that if you want to go the grand designs type route, you can build a beautiful £1 million net zero house. So that's great, but you're not going to be able to build one of those for everybody. And it's, even though it's £1 million is big, but it's also quite a lot per area. You can build more affordable net zero. This is passive house council housing in Norwich. But even that is quite expensive relatively. There hasn't been a whole wave of other councils following Norwich to do this. All of these are more expensive than typical new build costs. So, and this leads to the perception that it's just unaffordable to build net zero homes. We can't decarbonize our homes, and because houses are already too expensive, which is not possible. And there are some estimates of how much it costs to upgrade a standard new build house to being zero carbon. They're in the region of sort of 10 to 30,000 from different industry bodies. So that seems quite a lot to add on to an expensive house already. However, compare this to, this is what Tom Archer did. He divided the amount that the big private house builders like Persimmon and Barratt and so on, the amount they pay to their shareholders every year by the number of houses they build every year. And it's around £20,000 per house. So that's already more than a lot of the estimates it would cost them to upgrade. And then you have land values which vary wildly from place to place, and they feel like there might be some opportunity there. So the heart of this project, finally getting to the point of the project, is this. Can we free some of this up to pay for that? And can we do it in Greater Manchester? For real. We can do a little exercise, but what would it make to make it doable right now? And particularly right now, because Greater Manchester Combined Authority for the government for the region has launched an ambitious low-carbon social housing programme, which they call TANS, Truly Affordable Net Zero Homes. And the plan for TANS is they want to get 30,000 net zero carbon social rented homes built over the next 14 years. It's still in the early stages. It's launched 2 years ago with Andy Burnham there. So they're still working out what to do. So we've come in at quite a good time to be able to feed into what they're thinking. And we're talking with them, and they're quite interested in this. And so the approach we're taking, we've divided this up into 3 questions. What do we need? What does a net zero home in Greater Manchester look like, and how much does it cost to build it? Where's the money? Where's it coming from now? And at what cost? And what to do about the answers to 1 and 2. Are there ways to change where or how the money comes from to make it easier and more affordable to build those houses? So we're working particularly on the first question with GMCA housing officers, who have been very helpful and very open to ideas. We are using software, so this is Claire Brown's bit of the project, using this industry software to design a typical, potential net zero home, using local climate data to make it kind of realistic for the kind of energy operation. Mainly looking at net zero in operation, so the heating and the power and so on. If we have time, we'll get on to these other issues, or that might be the next bigger project which we develop. We're looking at how the finance affects how developers build and sell houses, and trying to look at these kind of chains, who is joined together through these financial connections, who are the stakeholders. So, and looking at alternative ways, and what to do about it all. So questions about, can we change the materials or the designs of the houses? Can we find new ways of financing the building of new houses or new business models for housing developers? And what kind of, these are policy levers. So what kind of policy levers are there? Who holds them? So what can GMCA do? Do they have to rely on national government? Is it local authorities and so on? So that's the setup. What have we done so far? So on the first question about the houses, TANS is likely to be a mixture of high-rise units in the kind of town centres around Greater Manchester. That's going to provide the bulk of the homes, I think, and then semis in kind of scattered around the suburbs. So we decided to go with designing a net zero block of flats as our first thing. We'll move on to more types if we get the time. But this looks like where the bulk of the building is going to be, so it makes sense to concentrate on that. We're looking at things like heating technologies. For a block of flats, air source heat pumps might not be the way, so we might need to look at other things. Fabric, including insulation, but I don't have a quick answer on insulation. But and Jaya has been helping inform us on what the latest thought on different kinds of environmentally friendly building fabrics are. Using local climate data, identifying real sites where these houses are going to be built, and working with our local housing association to understand their costs and the things they face a bit better. Tracing where is the money. So we're looking more at housing associations and social housing providers who are a slightly different model to the people who just build and sell. They tend to build and hold on to the homes and rent them out over 30, 40 years. Which I think is kind of a positive for looking at sustainability questions, because often sustainability involves taking a long-term perspective. So we're off to a good start there. However, they do need to borrow to build the houses before they can get the rent back from people who live in them. And they tend to do that through bonds, which is basically borrowing, often 20 or 30-year long borrowing with fixed annual interest payments. So you just pay the same amount and then you pay the original lump sum back at the end. And this money is lent by the big asset managers. I'll come on to who they are in a moment. And as far as I can tell, often ultimately they are those retirement income or pension funds where the money originally goes into the system from. And I've got a diagram here, I think. So to kind of illustrate it on the case study I've done so far, there's a house in Manchester, owned by Great Places Housing Group, who are one of the many housing associations active in the region. And here are some people who've moved into it, and so they pay their rent to Great Places for living in the house. But before the house could be built, Great Places, they didn't have the rent, they needed to have some money to build the houses. So they borrowed it. They went across the Atlantic there, that's the Atlantic, the wavy lines, quite obviously. And they sold bonds to all these people who gave them money for them. And the biggest bondholder is the snappily titled Vanguard Total International Bond 2 Index Fund, part of the massive Vanguard group, which is what we call an asset manager in finance. It doesn't invest its own money. It manages kind of funds which sort of, people put their own money into, and they take a fee and manage it. So they borrowed from them. They got their money from another of Vanguard's funds, the Vanguard Target Retirement 2030 Trust. Where did that get its money from? It got it from our anxious, future pensioner here, or from people in America saving for their future, basically. They put it into the trust, which then put it into the fund, which then bought bonds from great places, who then built a house. But then, so the money goes in that direction, but then obviously it has to go back as well. So it comes, great places then repay the index fund, who pass it back through to the trust, but at each point fees go out to Vanguard, which is a massive financial company, and they take their cut at each stage of the way. And I guess the question, so this is the general structure, and it does seem a lot of them go through to savers, whether in the States or elsewhere. So other asset managers are available, such as BlackRock, or maybe the most famous one, UK-based ones like Legal and General, Aberdeen, as they used to be known. So this seems to be quite the pattern across different housing associations. I need to do a few more case studies. And I guess the question is what impact that has on affordability, which I'm kind of getting into at the moment. But the final question is what to do about it, what alternatives exist out there. So there's a few different ways we can try, we're exploring to make the housing more affordable, to make it cheaper to get the money, to make it easier then to afford to pay for a really high quality environmental build. There are new ways of valuing housing to suggest that net zero housing looks better on a housing association's accounts. Perhaps factoring in the fact that they may have to retrofit all these houses in 10 years anyway if they don't build them right now. So let's factor in that kind of efficiency. There are some loans which claim to be sustainability-linked loans for housing, offering lower interest rates for sustainable housing. I think I probably need to do some interviews there and dig into what the details of that, how much better are they and how do they define sustainability. Different business models to incentivize housing associations to keep flat rate bills, or to put the onus on them to save energy from the housing. And maybe different sources, maybe the public sector could lend the money. The public sector does lend money to local authorities through there's various ways. Some councils have issued public climate bonds. So there are different ways to explore, and I guess the question is sort of how much will they cost? Will they make enough of a difference to really help the TANS program become more affordable? So that's where we've got to. What's coming next is more details, more depth, lots of magnifying glasses to kind of explore these and get to the nub of it. And then lots of writing to come late into the night. So we've got a briefing to do, and in the spring, and we'll be hoping to do an academic policy paper. So the briefing will be looking at the particular policy and who can do what, and then the academic paper, I think, will look more into these bigger issues of how it deals with the kind of the housing, climate, finance nexus, to coin a nice term there. That's my presentation. Thanks very much for listening.
So have we got any questions for Tim? I think we've got a few minutes to spare. Yes.
is there a systems impact of building green buildings, which then could lead to someone else building more carbon? I mean, I suppose because of the location. Okay. I don't know so much about the location, and I think, well, as I understand it from talking to the people involved in the TANS program, they have kind of locations earmarked already, which some buildings are going to go on. And I guess many cities around the UK have that. So it's more of a question of what's going on them. And there's lots of factors which influence where you build, to do with demand and transport and accessibility and infrastructure and so on. So, I don't know, I think it's probably, I don't think making the buildings green is going to mean you're going to build in a completely different place with kind of different sort of land use impacts necessarily. It's more of a case of you're going to follow where people want to live, and then you need to try and do that in a sustainable manner as possible. I don't know, it's the kind of the bigger systems and knock-on impact is very much in our mind though, so maybe we should talk about this afterwards, because it's kind of idea of, part of our questions about who are the stakeholders is we kind of cut down, the finance returns on this building to make green building today, does that then pose problems for lots of people's retirement, and is there going to be a big political pushback on that? And does that then mean we have to rethink how we provide pensions and that kind of thing? So, these bigger knock-on effects I think are really important. But I'm not sure so much about the land sites as a particular one, but maybe I need to think some more about that.
Thanks, Tim. Got another question on the right, I think.
Thank you. Excuse my voice as well. I'm also getting over a cold. I was just going to ask about if the bills come down a lot, which they should do, from the net zero buildings and more being better insulated and lower carbon technologies, can the tenants not pay slightly more? So at least there's a little bit more of an income stream there, because they'll be saving a lot. I mean, if they could split that difference, there'd be a bit more money to go towards future buildings or pensions or whatever it is.
Yeah, well, I think this is one of the models we're sort of looking at, and it's potentially, I go back one, or a few. It's in this idea of, we talked about energy services companies, so where you maybe that you get a flat rate bill, and then so the tenant just pays a flat rate, and then it's in the interest of the housing owner, the housing association, to get the energy costs down because they get the saving. I guess it's always a question of when you're providing kind of social housing, you've got people on very low incomes, and you're not really wanting to increase anything they pay because they're struggling anyway. I mean, again, you might say taking a wider systems point of view, the problem there is the low incomes. And you need to deal in other ways with why are people on such low wages and, struggling so much in the first place. But yeah, there might be that either through them paying a little bit more for energy they use, or different kinds of energy tariffs where you get a certain amount very cheap and then a bit more for if you're kind of using above a certain limit. I don't know. The picture there, which is with zero bills written on it, is something that Octopus Energy and a private for sale housing developer have done. So they really built some houses which they promised no energy bills at all for 5 years. But they cost 400 grand to buy. But there you are.
Okay, I think we've run out of time, I'm afraid, for questions, so we're going to move on. But thanks. Can we give a round of applause to Tim, please? Thank you very much. And last in this session, we have Matt Paterson, who's going to talk to us about contemporary crises and the net zero transition.
Thanks, Alice. So Alice hinted at the beginning that one of the things that this project, which I'll talk about, is about thinking about other things that are going on in broad societal development, the economy, etc., that shape intervention. So that's the sort of general pitch. But actually, what I want to start with is going back to Jingyi's presentation, and because that was also simmering. I'm going to talk about very recent crises, but simmering behind Jingyi's presentation was the crisis in the 1980s. Which you had to look up, and I suspect there's fewer people in this room who do know than you hinted about, with the miners' strike in 1984 and the assault on the National Union of Mine Workers by Margaret Thatcher's government. And you had a sort of slightly passive voice story in there. The mines were now empty, right? Somebody made them empty. So there's that process to think about. And it is actually really important if you want to look at British climate policy performance. The single biggest reason why Britain looks so good in comparative terms, whatever we think internally, 48, 49% emissions reduction since 1990. Basically, no other country has emissions reductions that high. The single biggest reason for that is the destruction of the coal mining union in the 1980s, and therefore the destruction of the ability to defend coal once climate got on the agenda. You know, you compare to another country, leading-ish country like Germany. Germany's still got very powerful trade unions, 3 very powerful coal mining-based companies, Vattenfall, E.ON, and RWE, defending coal to a hilt. And E.ON is an electricity company in both Britain and Germany, defends coal in one, never says in Britain, oh, we should go back to coal, right? Because the power's already been destroyed. So it is those things about for me, it's thinking about what's going on in society that enables sustainability interventions. And in that case, with all sorts of dilemmas and injustice, a very unjust transition, right? So it's not a nice, neat, positive story always, but nevertheless with important effects for pursuing sustainability generally, climate policy in my term. So in the context of that, this is a project that's already long run out of its UMRI money. It was funded in the first round of the UMRI priming grants, and it ran 2022 to 2023. And it was funded under the sustainability stream, but also under the Manchester, Melbourne, Toronto thing, which was part of the funding logic in that round at least. So we actually had, and what we decided to do was have a big team of about 10 people each from each of those 3 institutions. Hire an RA, James Jackson, and he did loads and loads of research guided by this big team of 30 odd people. Alejandro Gallego-Schmidt, who's working with Jingyi, was part of the team, as were various other people at Manchester. Not sure anybody else in this room, but anyway. So what we wanted to do was think about, we've had multiple crises in global crises since the onset of the COVID lockdowns in particular, and we sort of think of those as 3 separate ones, but albeit all intertwined, right? So you've got the lockdowns and then the recovery from COVID in 2020, 2021. You've got rapidly rising inflation from early 2021 onwards, then intensified after early 2022 when Russia invades Ukraine, right? And these all have very distinct effects, but they also intertwine in quite complicated ways. And what we wanted to do was to have a think through and just try and assess how would you work out what governments have done in response to these in climate policy areas that might be stimulated by the logics of and the dynamics of each of these crises, right? So there's some of the examples of that there, right? So the most obvious ones is supply shocks from Chinese-dominated supply chains, as China goes into the most severe lockdown of pretty much any country. The massive global recession, which of course immediately reduces global emissions by about 7%, which is actually, of course, what we need to be reducing every year, not just that one year where it happened because of a recession. The fiscal pressure that goes on states as states massively expand public financing to try and reflate economies and just to keep people alive, right? The various measures just to subsidize people's incomes. As a recovery, the single biggest effect of the recovery is, of course, natural gas consumption goes up rapidly in many, many countries. It's the swing producer in electricity markets. So as electricity consumption goes up, the only thing that fill that demand in the short term is natural gas. Natural gas prices rise dramatically. Russia is also already engaging in various geopolitical shenanigans to try and manipulate gas prices and use its control of gas markets to try and police what's going on in Ukraine and so on, even before the invasion. You get what's articulated in the UK as the cost of living crises, slightly different variants of that story in Britain, which again, Jingyi talked about quite a bit. And then you get the Russian invasion in 2022, which then has both the effects of directly disrupting supply chains, which natural gas is an important part, but it's actually lots of other odd things like we knew, like neon, that Ukraine was the biggest nobody knew that it was the biggest producer of neon in the world, which is very important to various bits of electronics industry. Also then important for green energy technologies. And then you get the disruptions from the geopolitical response, the sanctions against Russia and so on. So there's a whole load of things there where if you think about energy transitions and climate policy, all of those things are highly relevant to that, right? Both on the fossil fuel side of the picture, but also on the renewable energy, electric vehicles, battery technologies, and so on, where China dominates supply chains, global production networks, to all of those things. And they do indeed become, really important to that. So what we tried to do, and James basically spent, guided by the 30 of us, working out, well, how would you work out what the effects of all of those dynamics on climate policy development would be? Turns out, it's fairly obvious. It's actually really tricky to work that out. And so we scratched our head a lot, and I think we've got fairly imperfect answers, but they're always imperfect. But this is the best job we've been able to do. So, and one of the reasons we also wanted to do it is because the standard story about economic crises is that they cause governments to retrench environmental policy. The governments get less ambitious. Government says they get rid of environmental regulations. They don't want to put a carbon tax or some other environmental fiscal measure in place, or they relax its stringency in the times of economic crisis to relieve the pressures on business. There's some evidence from the global financial crisis of 2007, 8, 9 that governments were starting to think a bit differently and say, well, if we're going to get out of this recession, the way we do so is to make sure we invest in green technologies. But it's partial and it's ambiguous, and I think it remains so as well. But we do think, so against that sort of backdrop, we do think that with this crisis, as a generalization, that there's not really any evidence of systematic retrenchment of climate policy action in the countries that we looked at. We can always think of very specific examples. I give one there, but overall, when you look at the breadth of climate policy interventions, you don't see any widespread backtracking. And the second sort of major argument that we make is that the reasons for that, or what drives climate policy development in the context of these crises, is countries trying to disentangle themselves from a range of their sort of supply chain vulnerabilities, whether that's to natural gas coming from Russia, or that's to the dependence on China for batteries and solar photovoltaics and wind turbines manufacturing. Nothing should be taken to that means that any of these responses are remotely adequate. They're not. They're getting, if anything, modestly better as they try and disentangle, but still nowhere near adequate to what we need in climate policy action. So, in terms of some of the evidence for that, again, there is a database of climate policy that people at the Grantham Institute at the LSE maintain, and we sort of mined that in specific ways. And so if you look, that you don't see, so this is across 4 countries, Australia, Canada, Germany, UK. We did look at other countries, but part of the problem was the data quality for different countries varies so much that we had to restrict to ones where the data we think is reasonably reliable. And so you don't see any big fall off in climate policy development over that course of time, starting from just before these crises onwards. 2021 to 22 maybe, but it's again, the general pattern is not of a downward. This is a very, very simple count of the number of new climate policies per year being developed in each country. Doesn't tell you how substantial or ambitious those policies are, but new things talked about as climate policy. This is another measure. So the thing that took most amount of time was that the International Energy Agency has an energy and climate policy database where every year they record new initiatives by all IEA members in the energy climate related areas. So this is not broad climate policy things. This is specific investments. This is usually some things that have a dollar or a euro tag attached to them. And we went through all of these ones and coded them for according to a variety of reasons and said, are these things making climate policy better or worse, or we can't quite work it out, right? And so we called that pro-climate, ambiguous, and anti-climate. So if you look at the German one, the single biggest anti-climate one, that's actually a single measure in 2022, and that's Germany spending, I forget the number, it's some colossal amount of money on a new LNG, all the LNG infrastructure in Bremerhaven. So we call that, that's expanding natural gas supply, clearly responding to the crisis to get out of Russian things, dependence on Russian natural gas. They go towards natural gas, which is now going to come either from the Middle East or from Canada and the US via LNG networks. But for the most part, the blue ones, we see a fair, we don't see that many decidedly negative things from a climate policy point of view. We see a few ambiguous ones and that's usually actually where the measure described in the IEA database has multiple elements, and there's an amount of money attached to the total, but not broken down. And some of them are clearly good, some of them are clearly bad. But in general, the ones that seem reasonably clearly good for climate policy outweigh those that aren't across most countries. And you also see that spending is going up generally, pretty much everywhere. So then the other thing we looked at is what do they spend that money on, right? So not necessarily just whether it's good or whether it's bad, but what specifically that is. And we coded according to sort of areas. So is it being spent on new infrastructure for renewable energy? Is it spent on public transport networks? What is it being spent on? And there is this sort of, if we unpack some of that, getting a bit more ambitious over time, there are some sort of aspects to that which are quite interesting, which are up there, which I might come back to once I've shown the figure, or when I show the figure. But there's also a really important trend, even in the countries which are not so reliant on imports of natural gas from Russia, for example. So Australia and Canada aren't really reliant on Russian natural gas markets. In fact, Canada is trying to seek to replace Russia as a supplier of natural gas into Europe. But they also put significant amounts of additional money into mining operations for the critical minerals that start those green energy supply chains. All of those are also problematic in a variety of ways, but you can see that spending, right? So this is, for each country, the top 5 elements that we coded for different types of things they're spending money on in their thing. So you don't get the same mix for each country here, because it's just the top 5 for each one. For clarity, we had about 13 different categories, and it's just too messy if we look at all of it. So you can see therein, where's Australia, top left. So those green, bright green, no, the green one, yes, that's right. Yeah, the bright green ones is this investments in critical minerals. No, it's the grid one. No, the blue, sorry, the mid blue one is the critical minerals expansion. They start spending lots and lots of money on the sorts of things that Australia is well known for, things like lithium and other elements in what becomes central to renewable energy technologies. Again, Germany's got this massive spike at the end on natural gas. Okay, yeah, I think I'm nearly there. And so that was quite interesting in seeing, and we worked out, it's a bit hard to go into the details of that now, but quite a lot of these patterns, when you work it out, you can think, well, Canada's doing that because it wants to fill this gap, because European countries are trying to disentangle themselves from all of these supply chain vulnerables, and Canada thinks it can fill those gaps. So it's driven by this sort of geopolitical logic we want to do. The last thing we looked at, or we thought, well, we looked at lots of other things. The last thing we thought was useful, in the end useful, was just to look at fossil fuel subsidies. You might have expected that fossil fuel subsidies, which are already very high and still should have been got rid of millions of years ago, but that they might go, there would be reasons they might have gone up in response to the crises, because to deal with the inflation, especially to deal with the inflation problem. But actually, they only go up in India. This one was one where the 6 countries was good enough data, but they only go up slightly in India. And of course, in India versus the other countries in that sample, the subsidies are actually qualitatively very different. They're consumer subsidies rather than producer subsidies for the most part. So it's quite a different form of the subsidy. In all the other countries, they're either stable or they actually decline during the crisis. So you don't see this retrenchment of the fossil fuel industry being able to recapture its position. I will actually I would say a little bit here. So this idea of disentangling, what we also collected was politicians' speeches around budget statements. And in some of these are quite well known. The German finance ministers talked about subsidizing renewable energy as freedom energy. And in Britain, under Rishi Sunak, the government talked about it as promoting energy sovereignty. So lots of this language of taking ourselves away from things that make us vulnerable have been central to the rhetoric of defending why we need to go in certain energy and climate policy directions that then become things that can sustain climate policy in the face of opposition. So I will, no, that is so this is the last one. So I'll just pick up on that the crises, of course, are maybe the last thing to do is the crises are themselves, they're intertwined, but they're not identical, right? So that they to each other, right? One is a supply chain crisis, mostly to do with production networks, to do with green energy technologies. One is a simpler sort of trade war. We don't want to import from Russia because of their geopolitical aggression, and those have different sorts of effects. But it still, I think, overall remains that there's a common idea that you get policy dismantling in the times of economic crisis on environmental policy, and we don't think that's happened in this place, which is still interesting to observe and explore.
Thanks very much. So we've got a couple of minutes. Would anyone like to ask a question? I'm going to take the lady first and then you.
Yeah, well, thanks very much for that. That was really, really interesting. And you ended on rhetoric. That was exactly where I was going to go. Because I was really surprised by some of the things you highlighted today, because the rhetoric, political rhetoric, does change, doesn't it? It has changed. So is that just a strategic kind of playing to certain populist movements or parts of the society, or how do we explain that disconnect between political rhetoric and the fact that investment terms is not much changing?
Okay, so I mean, I obviously skirted over that quite quickly. So one of the things, I mean, the UK case is a really good one for that, partly just because we know it as well, but it's been quite visible. So you got a lot, and I think it was in that last slide a little bit, but I was running out of time, so I skirted over it. But quite a lot of contestation over the nature of the inflation crisis in particular, right? So whether there was a populist reaction against climate policy, which really also started during 2021, which I've also done some research about, and I'm doing follow-up bits on, associated with people like the Net Zero Scrutiny Group of MPs and Nigel Farage and people like that. But they made quite a lot of, in their storyline about support for renewable energy driving people's energy bills up. I think there's not a lot of energy evidence that really was very persuasive with anything other than a very small number of people. And the storyline, which actually there was a member of the board of the European Central Bank, Christine Strehler, I think is the surname. I might be misremembering the surname. Came up with coined the term fossilflation at the same time. And it was sort of fairly obvious that the reason that those bills were going up was natural gas prices. And then a little bit of sort of profitflation on the back by the energy companies. Hence the logic of windfall taxes and so on to try and prevent that. So I think it's actually that there was definitely, you're right, there's a rhetorical battle over how do we understand the inflation problem in relation to the energy transition? And historically, it's always been a storyline. Wind energy is very expensive. Solar is really expensive. I think that has rapidly declining purchase, and that most people now can see, you can put solar on your roof for $5-6 grand now. It's like it's just doesn't pass the sniff test to say it's all about renewable energy in ways that it would have done 10 years ago.
Take one last question before we go for a break.
Yeah, to be slightly less optimistic, do you think if you extended your analysis out another couple of years that you might get different conclusions? Because we got less climate-friendly government in the US, probably got less climate-friendly governments coming in Germany and Canada and maybe Australia, which you covered. So maybe it's when governments change that you get the change in policy. It's not when you've got governments of the same colour.
Well, I mean, in the UK context, all of this happened during a Conservative government. and all of this. And you could make a slight case, following on Anka's question, about that part of the rightward drift in the Conservative Party has been partly stimulated by, within the Conservative Party, that wing winning rhetorically. I'm not sure I'd push that yet. I think there's so much other things going on in the Conservative Party that are driving that the energy climate stuff is probably pretty minor. And in any case, I think politically they are clearly going to lose that fight. It's actually going to be damaging to them politically. But you're absolutely right that I would add in Canada as well. It's going to have an election next year. Poilievre and the Conservatives are almost certain to win there, unless something really weird happens over the next year in Canada, which is clearly possible. It has everywhere else. Why not there? So I don't think it's totally reducible to that. I also think, let's take the Trump, which is maybe the hardest case, or might feel like the obvious case. Trump, I think, when he gets in, is going to think that the IRA is great, right? The only reason he's going to hate it is because it's got Joe Biden's name on it, right? And he is petty, so that might be enough to scotch it. But actually, the logic of the sort of industrial policy interventions is actually utterly consistent with what he wants to do. And it might go in psychotic directions in terms of trade tariffs and all the rest of it. But the actual cherry picking of, the picking winners story of saying that, he's also now best mates with Elon Musk, so he's less hostile to electric vehicles than he used to be. And that's utterly central to the IRA's investment in US manufacturing capacity in electric vehicles and batteries and so on. So it's not obvious that the otherwise insanity of his government, which will be very considerable, will necessarily mean that there's much material things. You go back to his first administration, where I think his fascist intentions were less clear, but the chaos was evident. His rallying cry was Trump digs coal. He was on there with a miners thing, with a mining helmet on. Trump digs coal, and he utterly failed, completely failed to bring back coal. Coal continued its steady slide in US share of electricity production. So I'm less worried. I'm worried about all sorts of things to do with Trump getting elected, but less so on that, actually.
Okay, I think we're going to have to draw that.
I'm not optimistic, by the way. I'm deeply pessimistic. We are really up deep.
I'm going to draw it to a close. We've got a break now for 15 minutes, but let's thank all of our panelists. Thank you very much.